You're listening to the Feel Good Astrology podcast with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request your personal reading, go to feelgoodastrology.com.
Hey there, it's Louisa Tanner Munson from Feel Good Astrology. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked a question in the chat of one of my videos about Chiron, or Pluto actually, but this person was suggesting to me that they had Pluto and Chiron in a conjunction. And my initial answer in the chat was that, Pluto and Chiron are very slow moving. When they come into a conjunction, it's a generational aspect. It's not something that happens every day. And it can take up to 9 months to come in. So, Pluto and Chiron will be separate by, so many degrees. They'll get closer and closer and closer together. Maybe Pluto's going retrograde whilst Chiron's going forwards, or vice versa. They come together in the conjunction, a tight conjunction, and then they start to separate. So, the whole conjunction will probably come in and ease off. It could even go on for just over a year, but essentially it's a really slow moving aspect to come in and to leave. And then you don't get it for a really, really long time. So it only really hits a particular generation, and it really corresponds to the generation leading up to December 1999. So for instance, people who were born like from the summer of 99 right the way through, I think, for another year. In fact, I've got the dates written down somewhere. Let me just read. So I wrote in my community, it was an aspect that many of our 22 to 24-year-olds were born with, because it goes from the end of 1999 to early 2021. So the people who've got it are between 22 and 24 at the moment. And I'm recording this in 2023. Now, initially, I was talking about it causing a real pain of being alive, and also a need to control and possibly manipulate power from feeling weak and feeling traumatized. So I just wanted to examine it a bit more clearly and a bit more closely. One of the reasons that I wanted to examine it a bit more is because I always think that these conjunctions also carry a seed of the opposition. There are some similar themes. And one of the things I've observed in many of my clients who are born in the mid-60s is that they've got the Pluto-Chiron opposition. And so, it's quite possible that some of these people are birthing the next iteration of their own pattern, as often happens with family astrology. So I want to have a look at the Pluto-Chiron conjunction, the Pluto-Chiron opposition, and then also have a quick look at the Pluto-Chiron square. Now, I'm not doing the Pluto-Chiron trine or sextile. I mean, they're a much softer version of this variety, but I really wanted to go with the hard aspects because it's a difficult theme. And like I said, it is a generational thing. And we might actually know people born in the mid-60s. We probably do. We probably do know people that are 22 to 24, born in 1999 to 2001. I know I do. I've got nieces born in that time. And we probably know people born with the square too. So like, how can we support them? How can we understand them better? Because Pluto as a planet really shows us where we're trying to get control and trying to experience control, possibly because we feel we don't have control. Pluto also shows us where we might be bullied. It shows an outside influence that might be crushing us, or something that we feel oppressed by. So, Pluto always shows up as something we're struggling with in real life and something that we try to control. Because if we don't control it, it controls us. So it's a real sort of power struggle planet. And then Chiron is a real celestial body that describes trauma, and it describes victimhood, and it describes illness. It describes where we don't feel like we have that much power. And I actually think We always have power. That's the funny thing. And so how can we find freedom, which is what my business is about, Feel Good Astrology. It's about finding freedom and clarity, even when we're born with some very, very difficult aspects. So let's have a look at how we can free ourselves from these patterns a little bit, or understand them in such a way that it might liberate us. That's my aim. So let's bring on this Pluto Chiron conjunction. Now, the image I've shown here is for when it was absolutely at its exact. You can see the symbol for Chiron here. It looks like a key turned on its side. And Pluto here is at 11 degrees 23. They're both at 11:23 in the sign of Sagittarius. Now, where you have the conjunction, I mean, obviously this conjunction could be in any house of this chart. But what it shows is, at some level, it shows a feeling of being a victim, being hurt, possibly very traumatically. And it's also showing that at some level, we're getting power through being hurt. And it's quite possible that we might be getting power from hurting other people because we were hurt. So it almost becomes, could it become a game of top trumps? Like, you know, who is the most hurt here? Is it becoming a race to see who's the biggest victim? You know, because we get power, like with Pluto shows us where we're getting power and where we're seeking power. And then Chiron is showing us where are we hurt, where are we hurting, and how do we find mastery? Now, at its most difficult aspect, I would say that it's showing at a generational level. So people born between 1999 and 2001, they have this stamp of hurt and, I would say, oppression, and that the hurt and the trauma and the illness and the whatever it is that is disabling us is coming from outside of ourselves. You know, it's coming from an outside power. Now, it's interesting that this conjunction is showing up in the sign of Sagittarius, because Sagittarius is one of those signs that's very much ascribed to policies, religion, spirituality, politics, and all sorts of ideology. Like Sagittarius is a very ideological and idealistic sign. So it's also covering a lot of these subjects that we can't really quantify. So like all sorts of spiritual principles, all sorts of political principles, not necessarily things that we are identifying with, but these ideologies that we might choose to identify pain from. So, you know, I'm very aware that during this time, when Pluto was going through the sign of Sagittarius, we were very much sold the idea of a war on terror, and we were very much sold the idea that these wars came from ideological and spiritual and religious differences. So, you know, that's really in keeping with the times. So if we think about it, people born in this time who are now 22 to 24 have picked up some kind of hurt that may well have come from outside of themselves, and from a powerful force. Now, the sign of Sagittarius is also related to the 9th house and the idea of otherness and diversity. The 3rd house represents the opposite. It's like what we know to be our community. It's what we know at a local level, whereas the 9th house, or Sagittarius, is very much about what comes to us from another perspective. So it could be a different culture, could be a different race, could be could be anything that comes into us in a way that's unfamiliar to what we already know. So all of this, you know, just as I'm looking at it, to me is suggesting that people born at this time have a pre-hurt or a active listening for being oppressed by ideology, by being oppressed by religion and spiritual beliefs, oppressed by politics, oppressed by things outside of themselves. So they might be oppressed by things from outside of their environment and their community that is coming in. So they might be a generation of people who feel oppressed by the decisions that other people have made, like the ideological decisions that other people have made. And if we go back to, the sign of Sagittarius, I think is also one of those signs that was really describing some of the greed that occurred in the 1980s, where capitalism just went like, everyone started to inflate, like the markets were going, woo, where all of the people that have done really well in houses, all of a sudden, you might have bought a house. Like I can think of my parents' generation buying a house for 1,700, selling it for 3,000, and then the next house, which they bought for 3,000, and they were slowly working to pay it off. All of a sudden, the housing market changed, and the next house, their 3,000 one that they sold, or 17,000, I don't know, because they were sort of increasing, it then sold for something like 60,000. So there was this kind of really crazy time when all of a sudden the value of things just increased, and it brought in this kind of upward market. So what I'm seeing here is the people born with this kind of marker, they are suffering some of the greed that has happened in previous generations that has impacted them from a distance. So as I was thinking about this, I was thinking in more recent times, because obviously, there's a lot of people talking in terms of snowflakes, like the idea that there are millennials. These would be some of the youngest millennials, obviously, but they were all born around the time of the beginning of, the year 2000. These guys, more recently, they're turning 22, 24. And what has been on their radar for the last few years, not only have we had like the ideas of COVID and lockdowns, but it has become an ideology, and it has come from overseas, or it has been sold that, this is a China problem, or that it has come because of the fact that so many people are migrating from place to place to place, making viruses so much more easy to attack us or come to us from a distance. But there's also in very recent times a lot more talk around disability, race, gender, actual harm and hurt, and also climate. And so these are absolutely really big themes that are coming in, that I see that this age, people born in this time could choose, if in their charts they have a lot of connections. Let's say in this chart, somebody's got Pluto Chiron, and the sun is in a square. Like I say, the sun's in the sign of Pisces, in a square to this, they could very well identify with the hurt of their generation. They'll feel it really, really personally. You might even have the moon in a conjunction here, or you might have the moon in a square. They would also really, really feel the hurt of the existential pain that is coming from their generation. You may well find that they've got personal planets in opposition, which again would really trigger that feeling. Now, for people who don't have anything really connecting in, like at this time, the only thing really connecting in is this sextile to Uranus. Again, this is a slow moving energy, so it's not really hitting this particular birth chart in a really, really painful way. But where the sun or the moon is really involved, or where Pluto and Chiron in their conjunction are on an angle, or in one of these angular houses, i.e. the first house, the fourth house, the seventh house, and the 10th house, this is in an angular house, this 10th house here, they're very much in alignment with somebody's identity, their relationships with other people, the relationships with their parents, the way they live at home, and also their career. So these are the very sort of like most personal bits of their chart. So you may well find that people who've got like the sun and the moon really implicated in this chart would really pick up on those themes. Similarly, if you've got Pluto and Chiron in the 6th house, You may well have somebody who feels a lot of sickness. You know, the 6th house is definitely related to sickness and illness. In particular, allergies can really show up there. And they may well also get power from being ill. So that might be part of the dance that they play in life, because we all have programs, we all have things that we do. You might learn early on as a child that when you're poorly, you've got more affection from your parents, your caregivers, and that may well have become part of your signature, that I feel more loved, I feel more protected, I feel more in control when I'm poorly. So that's something that could happen. You may well find that Pluto and Chiron are down here in the 4th house, which can really reflect difficulty at home, because you know, Chiron is showing that the trauma is coming from home, and the feelings of not having control, the feelings of being vulnerable, of being a victim, are coming from the home. And then with Pluto there, it's often a very strong caregiver. Somebody very strong in your family is controlling. You may actually find that if you've got this particular makeup, you might find that you understand power so much more when somebody has control over you, and you might interpret that control as love, or you might interpret that control as being protected. So for you may well have a very strong tendency to attract very strong caregivers that do everything for you, and you feel very much looked after, and you allow it. So you may well kind of turn that control and almost allow yourself to get weaker so that you can get looked after. You may well, in the 7th, you may well attract very strong partners who take over for you, people by whom you are playing in a game of who has more strength, who has more, you know, like almost like with a narcissistic partner, or with somebody who is there to take control, and who likes to have somebody around them that's quite weak. You might actually feel strong as a person. You might get something spiritual, that feeling of strength, because you allow somebody to be strong. You know, you're allowing someone to feel strong, and you get strength from knowing you're allowing that. I mean, it becomes really mind gamey, because, you know, it's this victim and trauma and controller all mixed into one with this conjunction. And so unpicking it is really difficult, because who really wants to stay ill? You know, this is really saying you're staying ill, or you're staying weaker, or you're staying traumatized because there's something in it for you, which makes it really difficult to get out of. So I think if you see this in the charts of people you love, if you've got a child with this in their charts, it's worth watching out for, because at some point, like if something goes over this in a transit, it's going to get re-triggered. Or if at some point when Pluto goes into a square with where it was at the time, place, and date of birth, which happens to everyone at some point, possibly from the mid-30s up until the early 40s. It varies because of Pluto's slightly elliptical orbit. But, you know, when Pluto goes square to this area, that's going to trigger some of the original pain. Also, when Chiron squares it, which should happen before, but again, Chiron also does have an elliptical orbit, so you know it's not going to hit everyone at the same time. But anyone that gets into middle age is likely to experience that as well. You know, this core trauma, whatever's playing out about victimization, is going to come up again. Now it's a generational thing. Now, what really interests me here is in people born at this time, they have got their Neptune at 3 degrees and their North Node around, you know, based on what month, but let's just assume that it's around, 3 or 4 degrees. We know right now, as of 2023, Pluto went into the sign of Aquarius earlier this year. He's back in the sign of Capricorn. He'll be back here from January 2024, and Pluto is going to be at 0 degrees and will slowly but surely work closer to this Neptune and node point. This is going to bring up a bit of a challenge and a bit of a crisis for these people born at this time. Because when Pluto comes over Neptune shows where we deceive ourselves. It also shows where we have great creativity and a potential for connection and love, and definitely people born with this Neptune node conjunction. This is not the North node. This is a South node, but this is almost like a point of spirituality in the charts of people with this Pluto Chiron conjunction. I would say this is absolutely based on universal suffering, this Neptune and South Node conjunction. It's almost like a group of people have come in to experience suffering, have come in to recognize, they're not going to have as better deal as everyone else, and that they have to almost pay for the sins of other people. And actually, like, if you hear some people talking right now in terms of climate, in terms of like critical race theory, gender and pronouns and all sorts of different things, there's a lot of inbuilt trauma in our young adults right now. So I do think that this age group is likely to get very activated as Pluto comes into this position. But anyway, that's a little bit around Pluto and Chiron in the conjunction. So at some level, there is the identity of suffering and trauma and a level of control that comes in with it. And like I said, if your sun or your moon is more activated by, like, if your sun and moon is in a conjunction with it, it's going to play a much bigger part in your life. If your sun or moon are square to it, it will be something that irritates you a lot, and you'll probably get the chance to heal it more. Like if you've got your sun or moon in a conjunction with it, you're likely to identify with it and possibly not be able to see how you can get out of it. I think a square here would be quite useful because it's so irritating that you have to face it. You can't just be in it. You have to face it, and you're facing yourself off. In an opposition, again, that gives you an opportunity to really face it down, and that creates a lot more dynamics in terms of when you have your Pluto or Chiron squaring this opposition. That would really create a very strong range of situations that go on for you. So that's just a few thoughts about Pluto and Chiron in a conjunction. But let's have a look at the opposition. So I'm very familiar with this opposition because I've got a lot of people, a lot of clients that are born in the mid 60s that come, they've got a lot to unravel because, they haven't just got their Pluto Chiron opposition, they've also got a Uranus and Saturn opposition as well. So from 1964 right the way through to 1967, all people born in that time have got a little bit of this playing out. And I would say people from mid 1965 to the end of 1966 have got some of the tightest of these situations going on. But this is the moment where, or one of the moments where Pluto and Chiron were in complete opposition. Now, sure, there is this power coming through pain and suffering, but what I'm really seeing here is that power is seen outside of ourselves. I guess it depends, what are we identifying as ours? Is it our pain that we identify and that the power is opposite to us? Or are we in a position of power and the pain seems to be something that's opposing us? Like with the conjunction, the two of them together, there's 0 degrees between them. I always think of that as the first house. It's very much about the identity. The conjunction is, I think, a very sort of identity-based aspect, whereas an opposition to me is like the first and the 7th house. I mean, it's all based in polarities, but whatever things are polar in, it's a position of me versus everything that's not me. Or it's in the 2nd house, it's my resources versus everything resource-based that's not mine. If it's the 3rd house, it's like my community, my environment versus everything that's not my community and my environment. So you can see where I'm going here. So, which of these patterns, which of these planets in this opposition are you really seeing as yours, and what's the opposition of it? So for instance, if you're identifying with the Chiron aspect, that you're traumatized, then the power power in your life is seen almost as the causing agent of your traumatization. So I don't see it so much as an illness unless it's you're ill because of other people, like you're ill because of stress caused by other people, or that you're ill because of narcissists playing into your life, you know. Now, you may well be more identified with the Pluto side of it. So you might feel actually quite in control, and that there is somebody opposite you that's sick, really kind of almost sucking the control out of you. You might feel like you have to be strong to manage somebody else's illness. And so you can see this is very difficult to metabolize, you know. So the conjunction between Pluto and Chiron is really becoming part of the actual identity. You know, I am wounded, and I may well use my wounds to gain power because that's all I've got and that's what I'm going to use. And you can't blame anyone for doing that. You know, if all you've got to hit a nail with is a hammer, you're always going to hit it, aren't you? It's always going to be like that. So, you know, the Pluto and Chiron conjunction is always going to be trauma and illness and power come together. So I do think the conjunction people are going to be some of the people who get into riots eventually, and politics, and I can see why so much disability, equality, diversity, and these subjects are just coming up more and more and more, because we have a generation, albeit a very small generation, but remember, this takes a while to come in and then it goes. And these conjunctions, you know, like Pluto will go retrograde, Chiron will go retrograde, and they're kind of doing this little backwards and forwards dance. So these themes can take a while to, you know, fully come in and out. But, you know, we do have this sort of pain and suffering generation. And then the people born in the 60s, they are reacting to controls. So, for instance, they might be some of the first real generations to have divorce or be the divorcees, or to raise families that are split. And then they've got the split between them and their children potentially, and them and their grandchildren. It's like there is a pain because of splits. Which is very, very different to being born with the pain and identifying it, like carrying it like it's an unhealable wound. So the people in the 60s have almost got this separation. And of course, with this one, the people also have this opposition between Saturn and Uranus. And I've spoken about this previously. I'll make sure these get put in the same playlist, you know, of difficult aspects. But this is a generational aspect. So the people with the Chiron and Pluto in opposition, they have got power struggles causing pain and caused through pain, lots of parent issues projected onto partners, and they feel outside of their insecurities. And so it's very, very difficult for them to heal it. Now, but it is healable. And what I would say here is, you know, if you've got a third planet or something coming in from the side, like here we've got this T-square with Jupiter. Now this is really going to catalyze this whole pattern. Is it going to help it? It's going to blow it up for sure, because Jupiter inflames things, make things bigger. But is it going to solve it? Who knows? It's going to blow it apart. But I do like this Neptune here. You know, there's a lot of intuition and tuning in and healing that can go on. It's no surprise to me that during the 60s, you know, we're told that, you know, during the 60s, there was this moment of awakening, or there was this awakening movement, because we've got these really big outer planet oppositions causing great tension. And then what comes out of it is this healing energy, this rush to heal and soothe, that's definitely based in a sense of intuition and compassion. And so I think that's why so many people talk about the age of love, or the power of love, and peace and not war, and all of that idea. You know, so this is a very, very strong motif. Now let's have a look at a square. Actually, one last thing before I go. A bit like with the conjunction, if you've got the sun or the moon in one of these, then it becomes even more tricky. So, for instance, I know a couple of people who've got their moon in a conjunction with Saturn and or Chiron, which makes it very, very painful, because the moon is our emotions, our psyche, and at some level our mum. And so this playing out is very difficult. Also, I've got clients that have got their sun in the sign of Virgo here, which is very, very difficult. Or if you've got your sun and the moon in Sagittarius or Gemini, you know, square to this, then this is really, really catalyzing. So again, that's a really big pattern. And like I said, these patterns are often, you know, birthed in one generation and then follow in a subsequent generation. So anyway, let's have a look at the square then. So this came about, I mean, there are squares all the time, but again, it's not as uncommon as the conjunction or the opposition. You get a couple more goes at it. But the Pluto Chiron square is also very painful. So if we have a look at this one, there's Chiron here in the sign of Leo. Here's the square Pluto in Scorpio. Again, a lot of it depends on where it's showing up. Like if you've got the two square planets across your like ascendant and then the angle to do with your home, or your ascendant and the MC, that's going to be super painful. If you've got the sun or the moon in that square as well, or in opposition, again, that's going to be really painful. But with the squares, you're not facing everything directly. You're kind of facing things kind of just to the side. So you can keep your eye on it, but you're not actually really facing it in a really threatening way. And in the conjunction, sometimes it can be so close to you that you can't really see it. It's almost in your blind sight. So here, what I really see is that there is this feeling of irritation. There is something coming on. Like if the conjunction to me is like a first house, like an identity thing, and the opposition is this is what I identify with, and this is always projected, like your oppositions often show projections, then the square at some level is like from your identity to your home. It's like something that's to do with stability, or it could be something to do with you in the outer world, like the position of you and your identity and where you show up in the world, like the 1st and the 10th house rather than the 1st and the 4th house. But it's very much about finding stability. Like how are you privately or how are you publicly? So I do see that there's a chance to move with it. You know, it's not very difficult. Oh, well, it is difficult, but it's not as difficult as the oppositions or the conjunctions. Now, again, if you've got a shared planet or a shared resource, that's quite useful. So, for instance, this isn't quite so easy to see, but you've got this lovely sextile here with Neptune and Uranus. And likewise, Neptune and Uranus are actually in a quincunx, or in conjunct as it's known. It's 150 degrees from Chiron. So again, this aspect, which is Neptune and Uranus in the sign of Capricorn, which is really deeply idealistic and also wanting practical action, there is an escape. You know, there is something that is coming up to help you escape things. You might have something in a semi-square in between these two. You might have something down here, but like a third planet or a couple of other planets that are linking into both really shows how you might work out these difficult emotions and this difficult planetary makeup. Last thing I want to show you then, this is just how it might look. This is actually my birth chart. So my Pluto's here at 9 degrees in the sign of Libra, and my Chiron is at 20 degrees in the sign of Aries. A short while ago, I think it was in 2018, so about 5 years ago, Pluto was square my Chiron. Funnily enough, I can actually remember almost to the day. I was actually pregnant with my third child, and during that time, all of a sudden there was something very hurting. Something was really, really hurting me, and it came up. And it was something deep from my memories that came up in such a way that it created a huge breakdown within my family and our communication. Not my like husband and children, but other sides of my family, and it caused this very, very difficult split where we didn't talk for about 6 months, and And the funny thing is, the hurt itself wasn't the thing that really caused the pain. It was the aftermath. It was the fact that it couldn't be discussed. I couldn't be heard. And this is interesting, isn't it? Because whatever my pain was to do, Pluto is in my third house, showing that I don't feel, like the third house is about your communication, being heard, being part of the community. And during this time when I was experiencing or remembering something that was very traumatic to me and very painful to me, when I tried to express it and tried to control my understanding of it and ask questions about it, it was shut down and I felt like I was shut out. In fact, the way I perceived it at the time was that there was harsh language, very harsh emotions kind of pushed my way. And so again, the whole feeling of Pluto and Chiron, which is about, like, Chiron is about being wounded, being oppressed, but being a victim. And then Pluto is that there is a bully, there is an oppressor. In that moment, I felt very much like that I was being bullied to be quiet. It was like the more I was talking out, the more I was being slapped back down, which is often how Pluto appears to be. The funny thing is when I was asking questions, the people receiving those questions probably thought that I was being bullying and that I was asking something that was deeply painful that they didn't want to reflect on. So, it's funny how it's always seen from every different angle. But at that time, I felt so shunned and so silenced and censored that I just shut completely down. And there was no movement. Now, something else that was going on at the same time. So this is, bringing in some other aspects. But you'll see here, I was actually also going through my Uranus opposition. And my Uranus in my 12th house is showing that, there are shocking memories, there are some shocks and upsets, and a lot of intuition and sudden awakening, sudden realizations in the place of my unconscious mind and my unconscious programming. Now, when Uranus went into opposition with where it was natally, I had a sudden recollection of old memories, and they all came flooding back. And in keeping with the Uranus theme, they were really shocking. And they kind of, it's like I had remembered these things, but there was no shock. And then suddenly I saw them with new eyes. And because of the opposition, there was me and I was seeing them through new eyes. It was the retelling of my old memories. It was when I shared some of my memories to a couple of people, when they said, hang on a second, that's abuse, or hang on a second, that's this. So it was like other people's versions of how I remembered things stirred me up, because other people were saying, well, that's not right, that should never have happened. And so it's funny that there's this oppositional thing. Another thing that was happening, for those of you that know about progressed moons, at that time I also had my progressed moon right over this very sensitive part. So there was this sensitive thing going on, but more importantly was Pluto was there to show me that I could, my weakness, my vulnerability, the Chiron trauma that was playing out earlier in my life was being reactivated. Now, also, not long after, and this is kind of when it started to heal, Chiron also went into opposition to my Pluto. So there was a reprisal. It's the same planets coming up again. And this is my natal Pluto being opposed by my Chiron. So it's interesting. And like, if you know what is causing your Chiron pain, the trauma that you're identifying with, it's, it was interesting that, as this went into the full opposition, the Chiron Pluto, the trauma and control issues of before, they were starting to piece themselves back together. And they came up for, a second go. So, this is how I can see things working. I hope you don't mind me using my chart, but I just think with all these things, it's somehow more powerful to to share these ideas, when you've got a real life experience. And that's the thing, we are all going to have these real life experiences. And like I said, at some point between like mid 30s to mid 40s, you're going to be going through, or you're most likely going to have your Pluto square, and Chiron square your Pluto at some point. That comes a bit earlier usually. And quite possibly, like I did, my Chiron Pluto opposition. These are all, your early midlife crises. Then you've got your opposition between Uranus that happens between like 42 to 44. And that comes up. And, if you can see these things coming up in your astrology, then it's really helpful. And if you can see that there's quite a few coming up at the same time, then it's really helpful. And it could be a bit worrying. And that's when you've really got to talk to other people about it to make sure you can interpret it and see all the different ways it happens. With this, I didn't really see it coming. I was in the thick of early motherhood and things like that. So when it did come in, it was quite a surprise. But then when I was looking back, I was like, oh, okay, of course that happened like that. So anyway, that was a little bit of an exploration of Chiron, the victim in us, Pluto, the bully in us, and also how your victim could be, you might be bullied by somebody else's victim. And you may well be doing it yourself. I say, we have guilt throwers, we have guilt catchers. Often we are all guilt throwers and guilt catchers. And there will be times when we're a victim of something and we choose to identify with it and think this is us. I really do think the Pluto Chiron conjunction people who are 22 to 24, and also, some of the millennials, they've got a lot of really unusual outer planet lineups. I'm really seeing in a lot of, what we see in the media, victim language around gender, race, disability, hurt, climate. It's like they're carrying this trauma for everybody and they're really feeling it. And whilst they're feeling it and complaining about it and campaigning about it, I'm not entirely sure if it's making them stronger or making them identify more with it. How do we find freedom of this? I say the first way we find freedom is to start talking, but taking the victim and taking the aggressor out of it. All the time Pluto is in there and we're identifying with the power of it. You're not really going to have the power. If you're seeking power to resolve the situation, you're not going to resolve it, because where someone is powerful, there's someone that's weak. And whilst you're identifying with the victim, again, you're never going to resolve it because you've put yourself in the victim position. So these are absolutely critical that we, when we are dealing with someone with Pluto Chiron square, conjunction, or opposition, that we listen to them, we help them see that they are empowered and that they might not have great choices, because that is also possible. That we can see where we may have felt victimized and also where we might be powerful in that too. And where we see all the little games that might be playing out, because being human is a polar experience. And, I'm not advocating that when we experience really dark times and where really awful things that shouldn't happen to us happen, there are still other things going on. And it's important to, and this is what I think astrology does so beautifully, is it can blow up every different aspect of the situation so we can understand all the different layers of it. There is always some choice somewhere. There is always something to help us find our way to freedom. So I hope that's helpful. If you've got this playing out in your chart and you've got your sun or moon playing into it, or someone with that, then this is likely to be a time in your life, or a lifetime, whereby it's a big priority, clearing what has come up for you. You may well have kind of taken on this burden of pain and suffering so that it stops in this generation and that it doesn't go on to the next generation. I don't know. We all have our different stories and we all have our different reasons for being here. But anyway, thanks for listening. And I apologize if any of it has triggered you at all. Like I say, we all have our own part of this in our charts in different ways, shapes and forms. And, the most important thing is that we can talk about these things openly and see where it takes us without, putting each of us into powerful or less powerful positions. But anyway, lots of love to you and speak to you soon. Bye for now.
You've been listening to the Feel Good Astrology podcast with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request your personal reading, go to feelgoodastrology.com.